okay? I put it within the larger perspective, the social media, within the larger perspective of the broader mass media. And by that mass media, I'm referring to things that began with the printing, the age of printing, newspapers, television, radio, and finally the internet revolution. Each has its own content, the adverts, the news, the entertainment, and so forth. Our discussion will look particularly at the internet and the things that are associated with the internet media, the social media in particular. This is because the internet, especially as it is condensed into that little thing that we hold in our hand called the smartphone, has become the main medium of delivery of all kinds of information in our age. The problem of the mass media. Now, I know anyone who uses the internet, and especially our smartphone, understand the positive aspects of the mass media. Yeah. But I think the greater challenge comes from the negative aspect of the mass media. And by mass media, I'm particularly referring to the internet, and particularly our smartphone. Yeah. And this is what I was focusing upon. What are some of the negative aspects that we see in the things that we are so familiar with? I think the first thing is that it oversimplifies. The mass appeal of the IT revolution means that facts are often presented in a manner that the masses could readily grasp. This means that complex arguments are not presented. We are not given the full rationale of things. Information is usually presented in small bite size. This means that complex arguments are often avoided. And oversimplification of things is very characteristic of the internet world. The second thing is that it distorts. We don't get the big picture. There's a tendency to concentrate on the juicy side of things, the juicy news, the marketable things, violence, sex, and so forth. And this results in the distortion of truth and sometimes the propagation of downright untruth. In recent times, you have been hearing a lot about such things as fake news. Yeah. In fact, the moment the editing of news takes place, a certain bias already sets in. There is no such thing in the news media as giving the facts as they really are. Because the moment you present anything on the mass media, you're already going through a process of selecting certain kinds of facts you want to present to the people. And depending upon the editing process, depending upon the person editing, the facts are already distorted, or at least are presented in a particular way. So there's really no such thing as the full range of objective facts that are being presented in any kind of mass media. Sometimes you have presentation of contradictory realities. If you take the example of a newspaper, or you can look at any other forms of mass media, you find that you would have on one page of the newspaper an advertisement about the latest slimming method, bath enhancement ads with scantily clad women, and yet on the next page you have reports about sexual crimes and a high degree of reported with a degree of righteous indignation. You see the kind of contradiction that exists side by side in the mass media. The other thing about adverts is that they work by hidden persuasion. They usually work using fast-moving images, images that flash on the screen just for a split second. And this presents to us images that are subliminally implanted in the mind. There's very little that goes by way of explanation. And the whole persuasion process is subliminal rather than rational and conscious. Also, there is a predominant worldview that's questionable. There's some good stuff in the mass media, there's no question about that. There are lots of good things that you can go into. Lots of good TV programs. But there are also lots of things that portray real life as if people don't need God or don't believe in God. Faith hardly features in most of the things that you see on television, for example. And if it does, it often tends to cast faith in a rather bad light. And so constant exposure to such programs will simply create or erode our sense of God in our lives. And if we watch uncritically, which is what the mass media tend to create in us, it puts us in a kind of non-critical, non-analytical mode of relation to the media. And when we start to do that, then we are being unconsciously programmed into accepting, perhaps unconsciously again, for example, a certain kind of lifestyle. For example, the gay lifestyle may be presented in a very subtle way as something that's normal in films, in stories, or whatever. And sometimes, a lot of times in fact, things like foul language becomes normal by repeated usage. And after a while, we are no longer shocked by all these language that may shock our common sensibilities. Now, I want to focus next particularly on the internet and information technology. There are some characteristics I think we need to understand about the IT. First of all, the IT is not ethically neutral. It's created by people with vested interest. The same technology can be put to bad and good use depending on the context. Just take, for example, internet banking is good for the consumer, but bad for bank workers because it results in many layoffs. It is not neutral either. It is not just a tool to be used, and it has both negative and positive effects. Information technology is driven by the need for efficiency. Note how the email has forced us to work twice as hard and as fast. We have to deal with scores of e-messages daily, and are expected to reply quickly. And so it creates a kind of hectic atmosphere. Technology is also an attempt to escape the constraint of space and time. It creates a new consciousness, a sense of self-transcendence. The actual location of people and places is unimportant in cyberspace. It's a space that transcends natural geography. The World Wide Web creates a world parallel to our ordinary world, a radical alteration of our space-time. It makes the ancient conception of a world within a world, like supernature and nature, credible. Yet, the parallel world is not a real world, but it's usually, and in fact, it is described as a virtual reality. But if one lives in that virtual reality long enough, as many people, young people, do, constantly exposed to, the internet world via their smartphone. If we live in that world long enough, the virtual world becomes incredibly real. As the chat room has demonstrated, and all kinds of social media have demonstrated, sometimes people begin to act out their fantasies. IT also brings with it a high degree of unpredictability, precisely when we try to control all processes. Well, take for example the advancement in technology. There was a time when CFC was thought to be a savior, especially in hot countries like Singapore. CFC is used in air conditioning and all that. Now it has become a bane. It's been known to be a cause of ozone depletion. Anxiety is also a hallmark of our modern living. Anxiety comes from rapid changes, job losses, frequent adjustment to new things, especially in the world of commerce. Our educational system itself, even within Singapore, is one example of that, of constant change. I learned from some teachers that even before existing policies could be fully implemented, new policies are being introduced, superseding previous ones. That's the kind of life that a lot of people live under. A world that's very unpredictable and that results in anxiety. But probably one of the greatest challenges that we have to encounter is the whole problem of the smartphone. It has the most pervasive and deep influence on people in ways that are often beyond our own imagination. It makes us feel connected with people far away via instant messaging. But actually we are quite disconnected bodily with people right next to us. This is one of the most famous graffiti artists, Banksy. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. He portrays here in this picture what love is like in a digital age. And I think that explains, in a very poignant way, the reality of the world in which we live. People seem to be broadly connected, and yet their minds are worlds apart from one another. It's just an example of how technology has kind of changed the whole pattern of family life. The traditional family that sits together for dinner doesn't seem to exist anymore. Each one is preoccupied with his or her own little gadgets, their interests, in a world of their own. The smartphone actually, it's something that it's a powerful tool. And it's something that we do unthinkingly, just like a ritual. You look at, you travel in the mass transport, train, bus, MRT. The moment one enters the train, out comes the smartphone. I often tell people that the smartphone, for some people, works on people's mind the way that Sauron's ring in the Lord of the Rings, if you have read or seen the film by J.R.R. Tolkien, the way it works on Gollum's mind. That's how the smartphone is working. It eats into our mind. It engrains certain deep-seated habits into our very being. I think we need to understand something about the nature of practice. The French philosopher Pierre Bourdieu, in his theory of practice, tells us that ritual actions, the things that we do constantly or habitually, inscribe knowledge implicitly very deeply into our subconscious, like the way we form habits of driving through constant practice. And that's the way also Christian ritual works. This is why, I'm going to say later on, the importance of ritual expression in our worship. How critical it is in forming us spiritually. But what we are seeing is how the smartphone has become a powerful ritual or instrument that ritualizes us into a different worldview. What is the implicit philosophy? That the smartphone is inscripting bodily into us. It gives people the almost godlike feeling that they are in charge. It is the idolatry of the self and the dethronement of God. It gives people a sense of the will to power. For example, we can befriend and unfriend people at will via the internet. You're, especially young people, you're familiar with that. You can like or dislike people based on very superficial impressions. There's also no inhibition in this world. Notice the language that's being used on the internet. The anonymity gives people the freedom to give their pent-up feelings full airing. Expletives, swear words, four-letter words are used freely in that world. I'm not saying that everybody does that, but people who want to do whatever they feel have this uninhibited space to do just that. And so you can see some of the worst things of people that would normally be said publicly being said over the internet. This gives rise to another issue, the problem of identity. In the past, people are shaped by stable communities, the family with a stable environment and a stable job. In fact, when we describe a job as a vocation, we are saying that that is a calling, something that defines a person. Now, we find that these stable things that used to give us our basic sense of identity have become very fluid. People are constantly on the move, changing jobs, including layoffs, retraining, even when one is already near retirement. I'm sure we are all familiar with that. We don't have stable families when both parents are at work. We don't even have stable churches. Do you notice how fluid churches are nowadays? People moving from church to church. They can just as easily be a member of one church and then next moment, whatever the reason might be, sometimes it's for no better reason than just convenience. They move on to another church. With a fluid identity, people are forced to multitask. And what multitasking does is that it creates what one writer calls a distributed self. That is, one no longer is defined by one's basic public role. In the past, if you ask a person, who are you? You're likely to hear a response like, I am the son of so-and-so or the daughter of so-and-so. Okay? People tend to identify themselves with their family because that's what gives them their sense of identity. Then you have the Industrial Revolution and the whole new way of life where people define themselves more and more by their vocations, their calling. Who are you? I'm a teacher, I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, I'm a priest. Yeah. But now, work no longer gives people their basic identity as in the past, especially when people are constantly moving from job to job. There's no sense of stability. The self itself is distributed. If our identity is so fluid, then who are we? Here is where the world of advertising comes in. The advertising world would like us to believe that we are what we consume. The important people carry a certain kind of credit card, drink a certain kind of beer, where they live, which school they go to, which school their children go to, and so forth. What we consume now shapes our postmodern identity. We are what we choose to be, to do, and to live. This kind of identity is foisted upon us by consumerism. The future growth of consumerism, just to quote one writer, depends on having each person believe they are able individually to choose their identity and to change it at will. Modern consumerists see themselves in terms of what is called data image of themselves. That is, the data collected by various corporations about ourselves. Do you notice that everything you do nowadays requires you to yield something about yourself to them? Data about yourself, your work, and various other things. And various corporations collect data about you. The insurance, the credit card companies, the banks, they want to know about your financial profiles, your buying habits, who you associate with, and on and on. So, modern identity is being shaped more and more by what is called data image. You are being shaped by the mass of data that are collected about you by various business corporations. Yeah. Just to quote from one writer, James Bollinger, my identity is being increasingly tied into a data image in which I'm determined by what I am for others in terms of financial benefits. What I buy, how much I buy, whether I pay back loans, whether I have high lifetime value for the corporation, and am likely to generate revenue for it. The driving force behind this is commerce, rather than the well-being of citizens. We know the old Marxist slogan that man is essentially a worker. Modern capitalism, by contrast, has sold us the idea that man is essentially the consumer. If this is the overriding identity of postmodern man, it's only because consumerism has become the most dominant mode of life today. Consumerism underlines the various and conflicting calls to find fulfillment and our true self by buying into one thing or another. Notice that practically everything we need in life now has been turned into consumer items. Okay. We'll talk about the plastic stuff a little later. But just think for a moment. In the past, things like medication, hospitalization, telecommunications, public transport, or basic utilities like water, electricity, gas, all these things come under the category of public service. And they enjoy a certain degree of protection and subsidy by the government. Now, they have all become marketable items and subject to the same market forces as any other consumer item. Thus, we have what is essentially now the consumer man. Person that's defined by the market, pulled in different directions by market forces into making all kinds of choices that we are told would make us different and outstanding or whatever. And everything depends upon the choices we make. And consumerism gives us the impression that we have the freedom to make these choices. And the identity arising from such choices we make is sometimes called the plastic identity. One could also speak of having multiple selves, or the protein self. One changes as one's task is changed. The internet chat room has become a place in which modern people live out their multiple selves. In real life, they live one way, but in the internet world, they become a totally different person. A kind of, Jekyll and Hyde syndrome is being created on a massive scale. What's the problem with multiple selves? This is sometimes the excuse for living out a life of duplicity or even multiplicity. It's a life or a self that lacks not only integration but integrity. A person may see himself one way at work and quite another self in the social media world, in the chat room, for example. Sometimes these different selves are confused and conflated. The naive who confuse the other self in the internet chat room, for example, with their real self, especially when they interact with people that they do not know, are often in for a real shock when they meet the person in real life. Sociologists tell us that role-playing, such as like children at play, they pretend to be doctors or teachers or parents and so forth. They tell us that this kind of children's play is actually very healthy in that they help to socialize children into the adult world. It is valuable precisely because children at play know that they are actually play acting, that they are not in the real world. In literature, this is called the willing suspension of unbelief. You dwell in that world, you dwell in that story, you come to appreciate the deeper reality that the story conveys. But at the same time, we are aware that this is a play world. The problem with the internet world is that it creates a virtual reality which makes it difficult for people to tell what is real and what is fantasy. As we see many instances of people fantasizing themselves in the internet world and actually living out that self in the real world and in their relationship with other people. I think we need to think carefully about how this is affecting us. And I think it's affecting us in many subtle ways that we are not even aware of it sometimes. Have you ever noticed how many modern Christian songs, I'm talking about the contemporary kind of songs, that are usually accompanied by loud music and certain types of instruments and all that. Many of these songs tend to focus on choice as to being what God wants you to be. Just to cite you an example, a song that says, I choose to be holy, to set apart for you, O Lord. In many of such songs, if you look at the whole range of contemporary songs, especially coming out from Hillsongs, the whole idea of choice is very prevalent. I wonder if this is an unconscious capitulation to the consumerist culture that wants us to believe that our identity is basically a matter of my choice. Cyberspace shapes our lives, but it is also malleable, shaped by how we choose to use it. And this means that we need to use it very critically. But a lot of times, a lot of people are not doing that. And so most of the time they are being shaped by that world. How do we respond? This is the second part of my talk. Okay. Pastoral responses. How do we respond pastorally to the challenges of the social media especially? I believe that one of the first things we need to think about is our Christian community, the church. The kind of challenge from the mass media requires us as Christians to evaluate and make appropriate responses. What constitutes a Christian response? We need to be part of a strong Christian community if we are to resist the negative influences posed by the IT world. If to be a Christian means to be part of a community created by the gospel, that means the story or events of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, then we need to consider how the gospel of Jesus Christ shapes our life. The community is the context in which we can carry out what John Euler calls the politics of Jesus, where we can find the means to discuss and debate on ethical issues under a common goal, finding the truth that we are all committed to live by. From the way the church conducts its business and responds to the challenges of the media, it could bear witness to the truth that it is committed to and witness to the world. The problem is that the modern church is not a strong community. It is meant to be. Its own agenda is often contaminated by worldly interests. Its members are not shaped determinatively by Christian values, but by worldly values. Leaders themselves don't think Christianly. They often lack a Christian worldview, nor do they provide the direction that the more committed Christians are looking for. This is the weakness of a fragmented Protestantism. Within Catholicism, certain moral positions are very clear. They are stated, presented in the form of papal encyclicals, for example, or pastoral letters. There is, however, a hopeful sign of a more concerted position, especially in our Singapore context, where the National Council of Churches are seeking to address public issues, for example, through its think tank ethos. Such efforts, I think, deserve our support, as they offer some kind of ethical guideline for the larger Protestant community, looking for guidance, especially in the area of social ethics. A more fundamental question is how the church could become an effective community that socializes its members into basic Christian values as a way of life. We need to begin with core ecclesial practices which form communal habits. Remember what I said about how the smartphone ritualizes us into a certain way of life? If that is the case, we need alternative ritual practices to form us into strong Christian communities. We know that regular practice forms habit. If bad practices form vices, then good practice forms good habits or virtues. What is more fundamental than the practice of worship? Because that's something we do regularly. But what kind of habits are we forming in people Sunday after Sunday? How does worship form the community? This question raises another important question. What is the role of the pastor? I'm using the word pastor in the general sense. In your context, he may be called a priest, or in some others, by some other names. Okay. What is his role as a pastor? It is almost a truism that that the role of the modern pastor has become increasingly blurred. He's expected to be a good communicator, a counselor, and an administrator, and so forth. But all these roles that are roles that pastors share with other professionals. What then is the distinctive work of the pastor that distinguishes him from other professionals? The Christian tradition has been quite unambiguous in its answer to that question. The pastor is responsible traditionally in the cure of souls, or to be a teacher of prayer. The pastor's distinctive role is to help each person to become a member of the body of Christ. In other words, to seek to form a strong, vibrant Christian community. The pastor does this by teaching prayer, because it is through prayer that each member grows into the body of Christ. Why is it so? Prayer develops relationship with God and creates the capacity for relationship with others. What we see in this ancient understanding of pastoral care is the close connection between pastoral care and worship. Worship is essentially corporate prayer, but it is more than just collectively praying together. It is prayer that culminates in the Eucharistic celebration. The pastor is the head of the liturgical assembly. In the Eucharistic assembly, we become what we eat. We become the body of Christ as we partake of the body of Christ. The work of the pastor then is to reinforce what is being done at worship, namely to help the people of God encounter God and so become more and more the community of Christ. Pastoral care cannot be carried out apart from the worshiping community. More specifically, the liturgical assembly. William Willerman, who teaches at Duke Divinity School, puts it this way. Our pastoral care is carried out within the context of a worshiping community attempting to live out its faith in this world. To forget that means that liturgical context in our care is to lose our perspective, our identity, and the source and resource of our care. In this context, I would say that much of contemporary worship falls far short in developing the Christian community. Modern worship is largely impoverished, especially our contemporary worship. I fear that this impoverished worship will have more harmful effect on the community than the good. Yet a lot of things that are being done during so-called worship on Sunday morning nowadays in many of our Protestant churches are precisely worship of a rather impoverished kind. For example, the dumbed-down version of the real thing. You see a lot of things that are being dumbed down, just like the internet world dumbs down a lot of things by making things simple. And that's exactly what we are seeing in modern worship. Koinonia, fellowship, is reduced to coffee during table, after church. Whereas the real koinonia should be taking place in our Eucharistic celebration or just before our Eucharistic celebration in the passing of the peace. And this passing of the peace is more than just saying hello to one another. The whole idea of the passing of the peace is to prepare ourselves to be a reconciled people in fellowship with God, at peace with God, and at peace with one another. Coming down, but parody of the TV talk show. Worship has become a poor parody, in fact, of the TV talk show, aimed more at entertaining or winning over the crowd than at encountering God and beholding the beauty of divine holiness. You have also reductionistic worship. In many so-called contemporary services, worship is reduced to 45 minutes of boisterous singing and another 40 or 45 minutes of motivational talk. Another problem is to reduce worship into evangelism or to confuse worship with evangelism. Worship is often turned into an evangelistic event. Instead of encountering God, we are more concerned about talking about God to non-Christians. But talking about God is not worship. And yet this is the confusion that we see. In short, modern worship has become pragmatically driven. We say that we are worshiping God, but we are actually using worship to promote some other ends. It's no wonder that while people come away feeling good, especially when the worship is very entertaining, there's very little of it that is life-transforming, that comes from a real, living encounter with God. What we do in worship, or what do we do in worship that really forms us? I think the modern challenge posed by the mass media, especially by the internet, can only be addressed by a worship that is thoroughly gospel-centered. Because only in our ritual of gospel-centered worship that we can create a strong counter-community, the real world, the real community, as opposed to the virtual world of the internet. So, let me go on and talk about worship as telling the gospel story. In worship, we are opening up ourselves to the truth of the full gospel and letting it indwell us and shape us, making us into a gospel-shaped community. Every community has its own narrative, its own story or history. It's its history that gives a community its distinctive identity and coherence. This is why you notice in recent years the Singapore government has been trying to get our people to learn our own Singapore history. Because learning our own history is a way to create what you might call our national identity. And if that's the case, the gospel story is what creates our ecclesial identity. The church is part of the story of Jesus Christ. Only if the fullness of the gospel is enacted in our worship can the church be formed into a gospel-shaped community. The church loses its identity when, for example, it stopped reciting the creed. Many Protestant churches have stopped reciting the creed. You know why the creed is important? Because it sums up our basic Christian belief, our basic Christian identity. It functions in much the same way as singing the national anthem shapes our national identity. Our Christian identity is summed up in our creed. I believe that in your own tradition, you still recite the creed. And I think that's wonderful. Keep doing that. Don't ever lose it. Like in many Protestant churches. I've been to a church that recites the creed every Sunday, and when I was conducting a worship seminar, I asked the people, the participants, who were mostly leaders of the church, why do you recite the Apostles' Creed every Sunday? And nobody could give me an answer. They don't even know why. I think we need a new catechesis to help people appreciate why we do what we do in our worship. The second thing is that many churches no longer observe the Christian calendar, which is essentially the reenactment of the gospel story throughout the year, from Advent to Pentecost, through ordinary time, until the final feast of the church calendar, which is the feast of Christ the King. I'm aware that the Orthodox tradition may have a different timing in the calendar, but it still basically follows the Christian story from Advent to the end, to the next cycle of Advent. Yet in many churches today, instead of following the Christian calendar, they are more preoccupied with secular festivals. They are shaped by secular festivals. There's more attention paid to events like Father's Day, Mother's Day, Valentine's Day, and even Halloween, rather than the Christian calendar. And what happens when our church is being shaped by all these secular festivals? We are imbibing the secular story. We are failing to be formed as a distinctive ecclesial community. Another thing I've noticed in some Protestant churches is the trimming down of the Eucharistic celebration. A lot of times it's simply for pragmatic reason in order to save time. But they don't realize that the Eucharist is where much of our theology, of what it means to be a Christian, of what it means to participate in our life in Christ is being taught and is being lived out, acted out, and ritualized, so that the truth that it contains is being inscripted into our bodily action. And yet, in many Protestant churches today, the Eucharist is more like an appendix to the whole service. When our worship pervades a truncated gospel, we lose our distinctive Christian identity. Much of preaching today consists of motivational talk, made up of threadbare cliches and slogans. We become more shaped by the world and its values than by the truth of the gospel. Only the gospel story can give us shape and meaning to our own individual life stories. But when the gospel story is no longer told and reenacted as a coherent story in our worship, then our own life stories are reduced to disjointed snippets. We lose our basic identity, not only as the people of the gospel, but even our own personal identity. And so, we substitute it with novelty, with exciting moments to fill up the spiritual void. And this is what is happening in many of our worship services today in our Protestant churches. Well, I have a number of other things to say, but I believe that my time is up. What I want to say next, actually, is to focus on worship as an intrinsic habit. Basically, I want to emphasize the fact that worship is a focused activity that's utterly basic to communal formation. And here I'm not talking about any kind of worship, but the worship of the liturgy of word and sacrament. Worship is not meant for evangelism. Worship is to bear witness to God and to encounter God. And it is in our encountering of God that our lives are being shaped. And certain intrinsic habits are being formed in us. Okay? So I'll just skip a little bit of this. You see, that's what is being formed in us when we worship. In retelling and enacting the gospel story, it forms the habit of attentiveness, focusedness. In encountering the awesome God, we learn true humility. The practice of thanksgiving, Eucharistia, forms the virtue of gratitude. The corporate nature of worship forms the virtue of cooperation. Worship has no particular value, we might say, except the fact that it is for the glory of God. Worship is its own end. Well, let me just give a few things because of time. Okay, let me just summarize what I want to say at the end. Worship forms us into a community with certain intrinsic values shaped by the gospel of Jesus Christ. The virtues of discipline, humility, thankfulness, etc., which make us a strong community, able to withstand the fragmentation of our postmodern world, the fragmentation of ourselves, of our communities, that's the result of living in and being scripted and influenced by the mass media